Title: The Silent Whisper. Chapter 1. The House Whispers. The first thing Charlie noticed about the house was how it felt alive. Not in the way that homes usually feel, filled with the faint hum of life, the creak of old wood settling, or the distant thrum of memories that saturate its walls, but something more sinister, more unnatural. The house felt like it was breathing. The wind didn't move through the cracks in the old windows, yet the walls seemed to shift, to sigh in the night. Sometimes, if you pressed your ear close enough to the floor, you could almost hear faint, broken whispers rising from deep beneath. But whenever Charlie looked over at Eric, their father, who sat in his study, lost in his thoughts, the distant sounds of the house felt as though they weren't even worth mentioning. He would always shake his head and mutter, "Just the house settling," before quickly retreating back to his solitude. But it wasn't just the house that felt off. It was the way Eric had become. Distant, withdrawn, and strange, in a way that Charlie couldn't quite pinpoint. The man who once played chess with them in the evenings, told stories of their mother, Jessica, and laughed easily, was gone. He had become something else, as though something within him had been swallowed by the house itself. Charlie often sat by the window late at night, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. In the evenings, the house would grow colder, and the wind, howling through the trees, would push against the windows with a force that almost felt intentional. It was as if the house itself were trying to warn them. But warn them of what? It had been a week since they moved into this house. It wasn't the kind of house one would expect to be haunted. It was large, yes, an old Victorian house with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and towering windows. It was impressive in the way that something ancient and untouched might be. But Charlie had grown up in this kind of house. They had lived in older places, homes with creaky floors and faded wallpaper, but none of them had felt alive in the way this one did. Eric had said that it would be a fresh start. But Charlie knew, deep down, it wasn't about a fresh start. It was about escaping something. But what? It was nearing midnight on that first full week, and Charlie had just come out of the kitchen after a late snack. The shadows in the house felt long and stretched, like something from a nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of dust, and the quiet seemed unnatural. No creaks, no rustling of mice, no wind moaning through the cracks, just silence. Then came the soft whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a voice, deep and distant, as though it was coming from the very walls of the house. Charlie froze, eyes darting to the study, where Eric sat hunched over the desk, illuminated only by the glow of a lamp. He hadn't moved for hours. It was strange, the way he had begun to retreat into himself, almost as though he was avoiding the world. Charlie walked softly toward the living room, where the whispers seemed to be coming from. Each step echoed in the silence. They could feel the weight of the house pressing down on them. The walls felt like they were closing in. The sound led them to the staircase, where the shadows pooled like dark water at the foot of the steps. The air was thick with something old, something dead. Charlie hesitated, their hand gripping the wooden railing, staring up at the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. It was as though there was something waiting up there, something that had been waiting for them all along. The house wasn't just settling, it was watching. Every inch of the house felt heavy, as if it had once been filled with life but was now left hollow. There were doors that Charlie had never seen opened, windows that had been shut tight for years, and there was the basement. Eric always told them to stay away from it, even when they were younger. "Stay out of the basement," he'd say. But now, it wasn't just the basement that felt forbidden. It was the entire house. Charlie could feel the temperature drop as they stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the dark hallway ahead. There was something pulling at them, a strange force, as if the house itself was calling. Something shifted in the shadows at the end of the hall. Charlie felt it before they saw it, a fluttering movement, a dark blur darting across the edge of their vision. But when they looked, nothing was there. Nothing ever was. The house had a way of hiding things, of erasing its own secrets. It was as though it didn't want to be known. Not by them, at least. Charlie stood frozen at the base of the stairs, heart pounding in their chest. The whispers were louder now, coming from somewhere below. A faint rustling, followed by a deep groan, like something old and tired shifting beneath them. The house creaked, groaned, and then stopped. For a moment, the silence returned. But it was a different silence, more suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. Then Charlie heard the soft thump of something falling, a small sound, like a book slipping off a shelf. But there was no shelf nearby. Their gaze darted to the dark hallway, eyes scanning for the source of the sound. And there, at the farthest corner, near the door to the basement, was something new. A shadow. No, not just a shadow, a figure. Charlie blinked. The figure was gone, just like that. But the lingering feeling in the air didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew stronger, thicker, more suffocating. Charlie tried to call out, but their voice caught in their throat. The house was alive in a way they couldn't describe. It wasn't just the whispers, or the strange, shifting shadows. It was something worse, something deeper, something waiting. They turned and bolted back up the stairs, heart pounding in their chest. As they reached the top, the soft, far-off voice whispered once more, "You shouldn't have come back." Chapter 1: The House Whispers, Part 2. Charlie's pulse thudded in their ears, louder than the faint creaks of the house. They stood at the top of the staircase, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead, heart racing in a way they hadn't felt since childhood nightmares. The darkened corridor stretched out before them like an endless tunnel, the very air feeling thick with unseen pressure. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was more ominous than the sounds themselves. It felt as if the house had exhaled, holding its breath, waiting. Charlie turned, trying to force their legs to move, but the fear gripped them like an iron vice. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This house, this place, had been a symbol of escape, of starting over. They had imagined a fresh beginning here, but all they felt now was the weight of something ancient, something wrong. "Stay out of the basement." The words echoed in their mind, words their father had drilled into them since they were children. It had always been a strict rule in their family, a rule that had only grown more enigmatic over the years. What was so dangerous about the basement? Charlie's thoughts churned like a storm as they took a hesitant step backward, their back brushing against the cold, creaky banister. The air felt colder than before, colder than any house should ever feel. Goosebumps prickled along their arms, the hairs on their neck rising. There it was again, the whisper. Faint but distinct. "You shouldn't have come back." It wasn't in their head this time. It wasn't a figment of imagination. It was real, solid. It resonated from somewhere deeper in the house. And it wasn't just a voice. It felt like a presence, a living, breathing thing moving in the dark. A chill swept through Charlie's bones. And before they could stop themselves, they turned toward the hallway. Their feet carried them against their will. The shadows at the far end of the corridor seemed to shift, to bend in unnatural ways, as if they were alive. "It's just the house settling," Charlie told themselves, gripping the banister tighter. But the words felt empty, hollow. No, this wasn't the house settling. Charlie's fingers curled around the banister, and they took another step, then another, slowly inching toward the end of the hall. It felt like walking through molasses, slow, thick, almost suffocating. Every step brought them closer to the door at the end. And then they heard it. A soft, wet sound. Like something dripping, but louder, more deliberate. Charlie stopped dead in their tracks, every muscle in their body going stiff. The sound was unmistakable. It came from beneath them, from the basement. A low, guttural sound, like something moving in the dark. Something alive. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. It was not just a voice, it was a feeling, seeping into Charlie's bones. A cold touch, like fingers brushing across their spine. "Come down." It wasn't a request, it was an order. The pulse in Charlie's throat throbbed as their body betrayed them, compelling them forward. "No, I can't. I shouldn't." Their instincts screamed, but the curiosity, the dread, pushed them on. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Every crack in the walls, every rustle in the shadows, seemed to draw them closer to the basement door. The wooden door at the end of the hall stood, slightly ajar. An odd sliver of light filtered through the crack, not from the hallway light, but from somewhere deeper within. The faintest glow, flickering like a dying candle. Charlie reached the door, the chill air pressing against them as they leaned in. Something was inside, something waiting. They placed their hand on the cold brass handle. The metal was unnaturally cold, sending a jolt through their arm. Charlie. A voice. Eric's voice. But it sounded wrong, distant, as though it were coming from behind a thick fog. "Charlie, don't!" Their hearts skipped a beat as they whirled around, their backs slamming against the door. Eric stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up at them with wide, frantic eyes. His face was pale, drawn tight with a look of terror that Charlie had never seen before. "Don't go down there," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence that filled the hallway. His hands trembled slightly, as though he was fighting the urge to do something, to stop them. "Why? What's down there?" Charlie asked, though they already knew the answer. Eric swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "There's things you don't understand, things you can't. I don't know how to make you see it." Charlie felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't like their father. Eric had always been a man of logic, of reason, a protector. Now, it was as though something had stripped him of that, leaving only fear in its place. "I have to know," Charlie said, almost to themselves. "I have to know what's happening." Eric's hand shot out, grabbing Charlie's wrist with surprising force. His grip was iron tight, but there was something pleading in his eyes. "You don't understand. They're not just ghosts. They're not just memories. They're something else." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. But before Charlie could ask him to explain further, something shifted in the shadows behind Eric. A figure. It was brief, barely a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision, but it was there. Something long and dark, moving just behind the figure of their father, a silhouette. Charlie's breath caught in their throat, the hairs on the back of their neck standing at attention. Eric turned, his eyes scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. He looked back at Charlie, his face twisted with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" Charlie asked, their voice trembling now. But before Eric could answer, the whispers returned, this time louder. Louder than before, and sharper, like 1,000 voices overlapping each other, whispering the same thing. "Come down. Come to us. Come. Now." The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and Charlie felt a coldness in the pit of their stomach, spreading outwards like ice. The shadows began to stretch and twist unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were alive, bending toward them. Eric's grip tightened, pulling Charlie back from the door. But it was too late. A sudden, blinding cold washed over them, and the whispers reached a crescendo, their ears ringing with the distorted voices. Charlie felt the force behind them, something pulling them, dragging them toward the door. Eric shouted, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of whispers. The house was alive now, a throbbing, living thing, its heartbeat pounding in time with Charlie's own. And then, a figure appeared. Not a shadow, but a form. A figure clad in tattered, ancient clothing. Its face was hidden in darkness, but Charlie could feel its gaze, heavy, suffocating. The figure reached out a hand. Without thinking, Charlie bolted. They ran past Eric, down the hallway, heart pounding. The whispers turned into laughter. Low, guttural, mocking laughter that echoed from every direction. They had crossed a line. There was no going back. Chapter 2. The House Beneath. Charlie's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering against his ribcage, each beat like the echo of a drum signaling the end. As they stumbled down the hallway, their eyes darted around the now oppressive darkness that pressed against them. The once familiar surroundings of the house had transformed into something unrecognizable, an unyielding labyrinth of cold shadows and curling whispers. The warmth of the light from the hallway was barely a memory now, swallowed by the dark void that stretched endlessly before them. Eric's voice had been lost to the wind, swallowed by the unseen force that gripped the air. Charlie wanted to turn back, wanted to reach out and pull Eric from whatever spell had ensnared him, but their legs refused to obey. Their feet moved as if guided by a force outside their control, each step heavier than the last, dragging them deeper into the house's suffocating embrace. They reached the stairs again, but this time something was different. The banister, the wooden steps, everything seemed to ripple, as if the house itself were alive. The walls twisted and shuddered, exhaling something cold and ancient into the air. It was a presence, something old, lingering, waiting. Charlie's pulse raced in their throat. It's just the house settling, but the thought was weak, hollow, and they couldn't even convince themselves. There was no settling here, only an unsettled darkness, a yawning chasm of secrets that wanted to swallow them whole. The basement. The whispers had already returned. The same voice, layered in distortion, reached out like a hand from the depths, curling around Charlie's thoughts. "Come down, it's ready for you." The voice was low, guttural, as if the words were being dragged from the bowels of the earth itself. The air grew colder, the chill sinking deep into their bones, as though the house were reaching into their soul. No, they didn't want to go. They didn't want to answer the call, but their body refused to stop moving. Their feet took them forward, one after the other, like a mindless puppet. Eric's warning rang in their ears, but it was too late. The door at the top of the basement stairs stood open now, a thin sliver of flickering light spilling from the crack, like the last breath of a dying star. The whispers grew louder. "Come to us! It's waiting for you!" Charlie swallowed, their throat dry as dust. Why had they come back? Why had they even agreed to return to this place? A soft laugh bubbled from somewhere deep within, but it wasn't their own. It was something else, something dark and twisted, buried beneath layers of memory and grief. A voice from the past, or something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Taking a breath, they turned toward the basement, hands trembling as they reached for the railing. The metal was icy to the touch, sending an involuntary shiver through their spine. Their fingers barely brushed it before they felt something cold and unnatural, curl around their wrist. They jerked back, but the grip remained. A cold pressure clamped down on them, like fingers pressing into their skin. But no one was there. It was as if the house itself was touching them, pulling them into its depths. Charlie gasped, stumbling backward into the hallway, the pressure lifting as suddenly as it had come. The silence that followed was almost worse than the whispers. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, like the air had thickened with dread. But then, the sound came again, soft, deliberate, like nails scraping against wood, or something worse. There was movement in the shadows. From the corner of their eye, Charlie saw it, a figure. It was barely a silhouette, no more than a shadow against the darkness. Yet, it was unmistakably there, shifting and twitching, as if it were fighting against the weight of time itself. The figure moved slowly, deliberate and calm, towards the basement door. Every step it took echoed in the stillness of the house like the death knell of a forgotten soul. Charlie froze. The figure's movements were unsettlingly slow, as if it were savoring every step it took. It was tall, too tall. The head was hunched low, casting an unsettling shadow that swallowed the light. The clothes it wore were tattered, dark, and flowing in unnatural ways, as though they were moving of their own accord. The air seemed to tighten around Charlie as the figure drew closer, each step bringing it nearer to the threshold of the basement door. It didn't seem to notice Charlie, didn't seem to care. What was it? A part of Charlie screamed to run, to turn and bolt, to escape this house that felt more like a prison. But another part of them, something darker, something hidden deep within, urged them forward. The basement was calling to them, with a voice they could no longer ignore. The figure reached the door. It didn't open the door. Instead, it stood there, its back turned to Charlie, its face hidden in shadow. The air grew thick, and Charlie's chest tightened. What did it want? The question felt too obvious to ask, yet too terrifying to answer. Then something changed. The air grew warmer, the lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The figure moved again, this time turning slowly. Charlie couldn't help but take a step closer, despite the terror that choked them. And there it was. The figure's face, it was wrong, twisted, a mockery of something human. The face was pale, ghostly pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. No pupils, just empty sockets, dark and infinite. The mouth was wide, too wide, pulled back into a grin that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. Its lips were cracked and blackened, and from them hung thick, dark threads of saliva, twisting down like serpents. The figure's lips parted, and from it came the same whisper. No, the same demand that Charlie had been hearing since they arrived. Come, to the basement. But this time it wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was a promise. A promise that if Charlie didn't come, they would be lost to the shadows, lost to the house. Charlie's heart raced, their mind torn between fleeing and answering the call that had already sunk its claws into them. They wanted to scream, but the air was too thick to breathe. With an unnatural grace, the figure stepped aside, revealing the basement door behind it. Fully open now, the darkness beyond seemed to stretch, to swallow all light. It was no longer just a room below. They could feel it, a void, a hunger, something ancient, hungry, and endless waited below. Charlie felt their legs move again, no longer under their control, but propelled by the presence in the house. The figure spoke again, its voice a low growl that echoed in the back of Charlie's skull. You can't leave now. And as Charlie's feet crossed the threshold of the door, the air shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows reaching out to pull them in. And in that moment, Charlie realized something. They had never been in control. They had never been alone. And now, there was no going back. Chapter 3. The Unseen Door. The basement door loomed before Charlie, an abyss that swallowed the light, making the hallway behind them seem distant, far away. The very air in front of them felt dense, suffocating, each breath a struggle. Charlie's chest tightened as they crossed the threshold, stepping onto the first of the creaking stairs that led downward. The house felt colder here, the temperature dropping steadily the deeper they descended. It was as though the air itself was rejecting their presence. Yet something, some compulsion stronger than fear, pushed them forward, one foot after the other, each step heavier than the last. Charlie didn't even know why they were moving. All they knew was that they had to. The walls on either side of them seemed to pulse, as though the house was alive, breathing, shifting, watching them. The flickering light from above cast long shadows, making the stairs below seem even deeper, more foreboding. There was something in the shadows, something just out of sight. It was always there, lurking just beyond their vision, like a presence waiting to materialize. Suddenly, the whispering returned. Come closer. It was not the same voice they had heard before. This time, it was a low, gurgling sound, like something trapped beneath the floorboards, its breath coming through cracks in the walls. It was an invitation, but there was no warmth to it, just a chilling promise that they could not escape. Charlie felt their pulse quicken as they neared the bottom of the stairs. The dim light from the hallway above seemed to die the further they descended, until they were surrounded by an unnatural darkness. At the foot of the stairs, there was only silence. The kind of silence that made their skin crawl, that seemed to swallow all sound, like the house was holding its breath. The basement stretched out in front of them, a vast expanse that felt endless. The walls were lined with old, decaying shelves, but the objects on them, if there were any, were too obscured by the shadows to be seen clearly. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, as if the house itself had slowly begun to tear apart under its own weight. At the far end of the room, a dim, flickering light caught Charlie's eye. It came from a door. It was small, inconspicuous, hidden away in a corner, but the faint, flickering glow seeped through the cracks around it like a beacon in the dark. The door. It was the only thing that stood out in the otherwise empty, decaying basement. A door in the far corner, yet it seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, vibrating with some unspoken promise of things to come. The rest of the basement remained shrouded in shadow, untouched by the faint light that flickered from behind that door. Charlie's heart raced. Was this the source of everything? Was this where the whispers were coming from? Without thinking, their legs carried them toward it. They didn't stop to question why. The door wasn't even particularly inviting, but the pull was undeniable. It was as though something, no, Someone was calling to them from behind it. They could feel it in the air, a magnetic force, a compulsion stronger than any fear that clutched at their throat. As they reached for the doorknob, it felt unnaturally cold beneath their fingers, as though it had been frozen over by some otherworldly frost. The metal was slick, like a forgotten relic, coated in the grime of years gone by. With a quick breath, Charlie turned it. The door creaked open, the sound grating on the silence. What they saw beyond it was not what they had expected. The room beyond the door was smaller than the basement, but it felt as if it had been carved out of the very foundation of the house. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges, but it was not the wallpaper that caught Charlie's attention. It was the objects scattered around the room. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface cluttered with odd, incomprehensible artifacts. Books lay open, their pages yellowed and brittle, and charred candles that flickered weakly in the darkness. In one corner of the room, an old rocking chair creaked slowly as if an unseen occupant had just risen from it, leaving only the faint sound of its rocking in the air. And then there were the mirrors. They were everywhere. Large, full-length mirrors, their frames adorned with dark, intricate carvings, were propped up against the walls, leaning at strange angles. Some were cracked, some covered in thick layers of dust, but they all reflected nothing. No matter where Charlie looked, the mirrors seemed to swallow everything around them, every shadow, every flicker of light, every movement. The room felt as if it were filled with 100 silent witnesses, all staring at them, waiting. The mirrors. Charlie could feel them now, pressing against their mind, pulling at their thoughts. They weren't just reflecting what was in front of them. They were reflecting something else, something deeper, something that didn't belong in this world. A soft, guttural laugh echoed in the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was something older, something that sounded like it had lived through centuries of torment. Charlie spun around, but there was no one there. No figure in the corner. No shadow in the doorway. The room was empty, but something had been there. Charlie could feel it. The weight of its presence hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating them. A whisper, now louder than before, slipped through the cracks in their thoughts, sliding like ice down their spine. "Do you see them? The ones who wait?" Charlie turned back to the mirrors. This time, one of them was different. The reflection in it was not their own. It was someone else. Someone with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, their face a grotesque mockery of humanity. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, but there was no sound, no movement. It was watching them. It wanted them. In that moment, Charlie understood. The house wasn't just alive. It was hungry. It had been waiting, and now it had found its prey. A chill ran down their spine as they turned away from the mirror. There was no longer any choice in the matter. They had crossed a threshold, and now the house had claimed them. There was no escaping what was to come. The whispers were louder now. A cacophony of voices, speaking over each other, blending together into an incomprehensible chorus of dread. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, thicker, and more oppressive. Charlie backed away, the fear in their chest making it impossible to breathe. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in from all sides, the mirrors reflecting not only their every move, but the dark corners of their mind as well. Suddenly, one of the mirrors began to crack. A single hairline fracture appeared across its surface, and then another, and another, until the entire glass shattered with a sound that could only be described as a scream, high-pitched and tortured. The shards of glass fell to the floor like rain, and in the fragments Charlie could see it. A face, twisted, contorted, its eyes wide open in terror. Charlie didn't wait to see more. The door was behind them, a fleeting escape, and they turned, nearly tripping over their own feet as they sprinted back toward the stairs. But as they ran, the whispers followed. They filled their ears, choking them, suffocating them, pulling them deeper into the house, deeper into its hunger. And from behind them, through the shattering mirrors, one last thing could be heard, a voice, soft, pleading, yet filled with a terrifying finality. "You will never leave." Chapter 4: The Hollow Watcher. Charlie's breath came in ragged gasps as they scrambled up the stairs, the door to the basement slamming shut behind them with an ominous thud. The house, still silent, seemed to hold its breath, as though it too were waiting for something. The hallway above, once bathed in faint light, now felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of what Charlie had just seen. The mirrors, the whispers, the shattered glass. What had they been? What were they? Turning, they took a hesitant step into the kitchen. The house, despite its oppressive atmosphere, seemed to mock them with its mundane appearance. The rusting fridge, the cracked countertops, the lingering smell of something forgotten. It all felt out of place, like a surreal dream. And yet, it was real. It was far too real. Charlie's eyes flicked toward the darkened living room, their mind buzzing with the unsettling echoes of their own thoughts. The house is alive, they thought. It's breathing. It's watching me. And there's nowhere to run. The kitchen door clicked shut behind them, and they froze, a cold shiver creeping down their spine. The house had always been silent, yes, but now it felt different, more alive, like it was watching, waiting for them to slip. The floors creaked beneath their feet, the wood groaning in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the house were moving, slowly, silently, inch by inch towards them. For a moment, Charlie dared to look back toward the basement door. It was still shut, but the weight of the dark space below seemed to press in on them. The air was thick, suffocating. They couldn't help but wonder, what if I go back down? The thought was ridiculous. They had just escaped from whatever nightmare was waiting in that god-forsaken basement. But something inside Charlie, something dark, something deep, whispered to them, it wasn't over. It was never over. Shaking their head, they pushed the thought away. No, I'm not going back down there. But just as the words passed through their mind, they heard it. A low, raspy sound, almost like a hum, coming from somewhere in the house. The sound was faint, so faint, but it grew clearer with every passing second. It was coming from the living room. Charlie moved cautiously, their feet hesitant, but driven by some force they could neither understand nor resist. The door to the living room was half open, the faintest sliver of dim light spilling from the crack. They reached out a trembling hand and slowly pushed the door wide enough to peer inside. The room was bathed in shadow, but there was something else, something wrong with the way the shadows moved. It was as if the darkness itself had a presence, a shape, a purpose. For a moment, Charlie thought they saw something shift. A figure, tall and thin, draped in a long coat, its features obscured. But no, it was gone, swallowed by the gloom. The humming sound, low and continuous, seemed to emanate from the corner of the room where the walls met. It was faint, yet its resonance seemed to penetrate deep into their bones, vibrating with a dreadful harmony. Who's there? Charlie stepped into the room, every sense alert, every muscle tensed. The floorboards groaned underfoot as they crossed the room, drawn to the sound, drawn to the corner. The deeper they moved into the shadows, the stronger the humming became. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, an ache in the air pulling at their soul. And then they saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, an object sat atop a small wooden pedestal. It was an ornate mirror, encased in a golden frame that was decorated with symbols Charlie didn't recognize. It was a mirror unlike any they had ever seen before. Its surface seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though it was alive, breathing in time with the rhythm of the house. The humming grew louder as they approached, and they could feel it vibrating through their chest, rattling their very core. Charlie felt an almost magnetic pull toward the mirror, a compulsion that they couldn't fight. Their hands trembled as they reached out to touch the cool glass. The moment their fingers made contact, the humming stopped. All sound in the room ceased. It was as if the entire house held its breath in that moment, waiting. And then, the mirror shifted. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of movement. But then, it became undeniable. The reflection in the glass began to warp, like a distortion in time, the edges rippling as though the surface were no longer solid. The room behind Charlie appeared in the mirror, but it was wrong, twisted. The walls seemed to bend at odd angles, and the shadows cast from the flickering light didn't match the natural shapes they should have. But it wasn't just the room that was wrong. It was the figure that stood there. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by darkness, standing motionless. The figure's hands were outstretched toward Charlie, fingers curled as if to grab them. The reflection was unnatural. The figure wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't human. The air grew thick, like fog rolling in from nowhere. Charlie stumbled back, the mirror's pull strong and undeniable. But their foot caught on something. A rug, old and worn, and they fell backward, crashing to the floor with a thud that echoed through the house. The mirror's surface rippled one last time before everything went still. Nothing. The room was silent again. The mirror, now calm and unchanging, reflected only the empty space around them. There was no figure, no movement, just a quiet stillness, broken only by the pounding of Charlie's own heart. But Charlie knew. They felt it. The figure, the thing behind the mirror, it was still there, watching, waiting. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. Charlie pulled themselves up from the floor, their mind racing. The house felt different now, heavier, like something had awakened, something that wasn't supposed to be here. Then, as they turned to leave, a voice, soft, almost gentle, whispered in their ear. "Come back." It was a single word, spoken in a tone that was both inviting and ominous. It was the same voice Charlie had heard before, the voice that had followed them down to the basement, the voice that had beckoned them to this very spot. But it wasn't the voice that sent a chill down Charlie's spine. It was the realization that the voice was not coming from the mirror. No, it was coming from behind them. Charlie spun around, heart pounding, to find nothing but the empty room. The walls loomed close, the shadows stretching toward them, hungry and suffocating. No, not again. Please, not again. Their pulse quickened as they stumbled toward the door, feeling as though the shadows were following them, closing in with every step. But before they could reach the doorway, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. In that instant, the floor beneath them seemed to disappear. The air rushed out of their lungs as they fell into nothing. And when they landed, they didn't land on the floor of the living room. They landed somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, somewhere alive. Chapter 5. The Eyes in the Walls. The darkness swallowed them whole. Charlie's mind spun as they tried to orient themselves in the complete blackness. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very house had wrapped its fingers around them, pulling them deeper into its unseen depths. Their breath came in shallow gasps, the cold biting at their skin. It felt wrong, too still, too quiet, like the silence before a storm. But no storm was coming. Not one that they could see, not one that they could survive. They tried to stand but found themselves unbalanced, their limbs sluggish and disoriented. They were no longer in the living room, no longer in the place they had tried to escape from. They were somewhere else now, somewhere worse. The floor beneath them felt uneven, as if they were no longer on solid ground. With trembling hands, they reached out, expecting to find the familiar walls of the house. Instead, their fingers brushed against something, soft, like flesh. A quick shiver ran down their spine, and they recoiled, heart hammering in their chest. But then the silence broke. A whisper, a low, grating sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was an unintelligible murmur, as if the house itself was speaking in a tongue too ancient, too twisted to comprehend. Charlie's pulse raced. They had to find a way out, had to move, to keep moving, to not stay still for too long. The longer they lingered in this oppressive darkness, the more suffocating it became. But every step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the labyrinthine nightmare. A sudden crack echoed through the air, a sharp snap of something splintering, like bones snapping underfoot. Charlie froze, eyes wide, straining to see anything in the pitch blackness. And then they heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging along wood. It came from ahead, from somewhere beyond their reach, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the floorboards creaking. No, this was something else. Something that shouldn't be. It was alive. Charlie's heart pounded in their ears as they forced themselves to take a step forward. The sound of scratching continued, relentless, dragging against the walls. It wasn't a random noise. It was methodical, calculated. The smell hit them next. It was faint at first, like rot, old decay. But it wasn't just the stench of something dead. There was something more sinister underneath it. An odor so unnatural it made Charlie's stomach turn. Something sharp, acrid, something that shouldn't have been inside the house. With every breath, the darkness around them seemed to tighten. The walls closed in. The air grew thicker, suffocating. But Charlie couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. The scraping was getting louder, closer. Then, in the distance, they saw a faint glimmer of light. It flickered once, then twice, like a candle flame dancing in the wind. Charlie's eyes locked onto it, desperate for anything that wasn't this suffocating blackness. They pushed forward, faster now, as the light seemed to beckon them closer. As they neared, the air around them felt colder. The temperature dropped, a chill creeping up their spine. Charlie could feel their breath condensing in front of them, turning to mist in the oppressive air. But they couldn't stop. And then, just as they reached the light, it vanished. A guttural laugh echoed from somewhere deep in the darkness. It was low and distorted, like the sound of something breaking, snapping. It vibrated through their chest, a sound that came from within them, from the very marrow of their bones. Charlie stumbled backward, panic rising in their throat. They turned, looking for another escape, but the room around them had changed. The walls were different now. The very fabric of the space had twisted. What was once the living room now looked like a distorted version of itself. The furniture was wrong, angled at strange, unnatural positions. The shadows had deepened, stretched long across the floor, writhing like creatures in the dark. Charlie's heart skipped as they saw something. Eyes. There were eyes, hundreds of them, glaring at them from the walls. Eyes that weren't there a moment ago. Eyes embedded in the walls themselves, staring out from the cracks and crevices, following their every movement. Each one glowed faintly, a soft, unblinking light. But the more they looked, the more they realized the eyes were not just looking at them. They were waiting, watching. A low, guttural whisper slid through the air, so close that Charlie could feel the cold breath on their neck. "You can never escape." The words didn't come from the air. They didn't come from the walls or the floor. They came from the eyes that blinked and glimmered like forgotten stars. Charlie's knees buckled beneath them, and they collapsed onto the floor, a scream dying in their throat. Their body refused to obey, to run, to move. They could only stare at the eyes that were alive, the eyes that had always been there. In the walls, in the dark, watching, a single tear ran down Charlie's face as they trembled, struggling to pull themselves together. "What do you want from me?" The laughter returned, louder this time, booming from all directions. It was the sound of something old, something ancient, mocking them. The walls shook with the force of it, rattling like dry bones, and Charlie felt the overwhelming sense that they were no longer alone, that whatever had been watching them had now stepped into the room. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretched and crooked, as though its body had been warped by something monstrous. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Charlie could feel its presence, suffocating, closing in on them. The figure's lips parted, a voice escaping from its throat, hollow and cold. "You can never leave," it whispered. "You are ours now." The words were a death sentence. They were trapped. But even as the figure took a step forward, the walls seemed to pulse, their eyes growing wider, the light from them bleeding into the room. And for the briefest moment, Charlie saw something else. A crack in the wall, a small, jagged opening that hadn't been there before. And as the figure moved closer, the eyes growing brighter, hotter, their gaze burning into Charlie's soul, the crack began to widen. A way out, a breath of fresh air. Charlie bolted, propelled by pure instinct. They scrambled toward the crack, tearing at the walls, their fingers bloody as they dug into the rough surface, scraping away the remnants of the wall. The figure's hands reached out for them, cold and heavy like iron, but they were too close to the opening. With one final push, Charlie forced themselves through the crack, feeling the rough edges tear at their skin as they squeezed through, gasping for breath as they fell into the void beyond. And the laughter, it didn't stop. It only grew louder. Chapter 6. The Whispers in the Dark. And the crack had led Charlie into another world, or at least that's what it felt like. There was no light here, no warmth, no sense of anything familiar. The air was thin, bitter, as if every breath they took came from somewhere far beyond the physical realm. They couldn't see their hands in front of their face, but they could feel them, trembling, ghostly wisps of movement. The silence was suffocating. Charlie stood motionless, wondering if they had just moved from one part of the nightmare to another, only to realize with a cold shiver that they could no longer hear the laughter. The walls of the other world were gone, replaced by something far worse, something that pressed against their skin with every breath they took. This was no longer a house, no longer a space that had ever been part of the living world. It was something else entirely. A soft breeze brushed past them, but it wasn't real. Nothing here was. It felt like being submerged in water, or floating through a cloud, heavy and thick with fog. Yet Charlie's senses were keenly aware of the overwhelming wrongness of it all. The air felt wrong. The coldness was wrong. And the silence. Oh, the silence was the most unsettling of all. And then, without warning, the sound came. It was quiet at first, just a whisper, a rustling sound too faint to decipher. Charlie strained, their pulse quickening, but the whispers only grew. They weren't random murmurs. No, they were words, tangled together in a language that was incomprehensible, jumbled and jagged, slipping like sand through their fingers. The whispers surrounded them, coming from every direction, slipping under their skin, wrapping around their bones. "Leave now," it hissed. The voice was ancient, soft yet searing, like a burning ember, whispering words too old for mortal ears. Charlie pressed their hands to their ears in an attempt to block out the noise, but it was no use. The whispers clawed their way through, worming their way into Charlie's mind, scratching at the edges of their sanity. "Leave, before it is too late." The words were growing more insistent now, more forceful, as if the very air was trying to push them out, push them away, as if this space itself wanted Charlie gone. But where could they go? They could hardly remember the way they'd come, and what little they did remember felt like a dream, like it had never been real. The crack, was that even real? Or had they imagined it in their panic? Had they imagined the entity, the eyes in the walls? A sudden gust of cold air shot through the space, sharper than before, sending a shiver of ice crawling along their spine. It smelled like rot, the unmistakable scent of something decayed and forgotten. Like the air had been sealed for centuries, cut off from life, its staleness eating away at everything it touched. It choked the life out of the world until everything was dying, or perhaps already dead. The whispers rose in volume, melding together in a cacophony that threatened to shatter Charlie's mind. Some were voices of anguish, others sounded frantic, but they were all desperate, pleading, warning. "Don't look at them." Charlie froze. Their hearts skipped a beat. Something had changed. The silence had given way to the whispers. But now, something else was rising from the depths of that oppressive nothingness. It was a presence. A shadow in the dark that wasn't quite a shadow. It moved, shifted, coalescing like a mass of fog, but denser, thicker, and darker. It began to take shape, twisting and contorting with a strange fluidity, as if it were a being without form, one that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be. Charlie's breath caught in their throat as the shape began to materialize before them, impossibly tall, its body shrouded in dark, undulating tendrils that swirled and twisted like snakes in the wind. The figure loomed above them, its form stretching and distorting, moving in a way that was utterly unnatural. It was humanoid, and yet it wasn't. The face was the worst part, or perhaps it was the lack of a face. It was an impossibility, an absence, a black void where features should have been, but something worse than that lay beneath. A sharp, jagged grin split the void of its face, stretching unnaturally wide, showing rows of pointed teeth that glistened in the darkness like knives, and its eyes, they were black, endless, Pools of despair that flickered with something unspoken, something old. The eyes were not empty, not at all. They were hungry. "Do you hear them?" The voice came, low and rasping, as if it were tearing its words from the throat of something unholy. "The whispers. They are here to guide you, to warn you." Charlie stumbled back, their legs trembling beneath them. "What are you?" The figure didn't answer, but the ground beneath Charlie's feet trembled. The walls of this place groaned, shaking as if something was stirring deep within. The whispers grew louder. They were everywhere now, suffocating, crashing in from every direction. And the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. Every step it took reverberated through the ground, shaking the air, vibrating in Charlie's chest. "I am the one who waits," it murmured. "I am the one who watches. I have been here, in this place, long before you came. And long after you leave, I will remain." Its voice curled around Charlie like tendrils of smoke, filling every corner of their mind. But it wasn't just its voice. It wasn't just the figure. The very space around them, no, the very existence of the place, was alive. It pulsed with an energy that felt wrong, like it was aware of them, aware of everything. A consciousness that had waited for too long to be noticed. The figure moved forward, and with every step, the air grew thicker, heavier, until it felt like the weight of the world itself was crushing them. "Leave now," it whispered again, a command this time, not a plea. Charlie couldn't move. They couldn't even speak. Their body had frozen in place, caught in the impossibility of this creature's presence. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had only grown more intense. And now they could hear something else, something indistinct, foreign, alive. The floor beneath them shuddered, and with a sudden jerk, the world tilted. The figure loomed closer, its twisted limbs stretching farther, impossibly long. They reached out, their fingers curling in the air, snaking toward Charlie. "Do you hear them?" the voice asked again, more insistent. "They are all around you. You cannot escape. No one can. They will find you, just like they found me." Charlie's heart raced in panic. No. They backed away, their legs still shaking. Their breath was ragged, but they couldn't breathe. Not anymore. The air was suffocating, each breath feeling like a choke. The figure reached for them, its fingers long and brittle. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure lunged forward, faster than Charlie could comprehend. Chapter 7. The Hunger That Lurks. But the air was thick. Charlie's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle as the suffocating weight of the place pressed down upon them. The whispers, endless and incomprehensible, churned in the atmosphere like a violent storm. Each syllable seemed to scrape against their mind, pulling at the edges of their sanity. They could no longer tell where the whispers began or ended. They were everywhere, inside their thoughts, in their bones, under their skin. And still, the figure was there, looming, watching. It had vanished for a moment, as if it had never been there at all, but its presence lingered like a bad taste in the back of Charlie's throat. Something about it had shifted. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something alive, something aware. Charlie stumbled backward, their legs unsteady beneath them, their body trembling with fear. But they couldn't tear their eyes away from the blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Every corner of this place felt wrong, so terribly wrong. "Leave now," came the voice again, low and raspy, but somehow closer this time, as if it were breathing directly into Charlie's ear. They flinched, their eyes darting around, searching for the source, but the darkness swallowed everything. There was nothing to see, nothing to hold on to. The air had turned so cold, their breath now visible in front of them in ghostly clouds. A loud, sharp noise pierced through the silence, a crack, like the sound of bones snapping under pressure. The floor beneath Charlie's feet shifted, groaning in protest. Something was moving in the dark, something far too close for comfort. Charlie spun around, heart racing in their chest, but they still couldn't see anything. Not fully. There was only the suffocating blackness, and the way it seemed to watch, to wait. And then they heard it. A scrape. Soft at first, but unmistakable. The sound of something sharp dragging across stone. Slow, deliberate, as if it were testing the air, sensing its prey. The hairs on the back of Charlie's neck stood on end, and for the first time, they understood the whispers. They weren't just warnings. They were hunger, the hunger that lurked. Charlie's pulse quickened. The floor creaked again, this time louder, and they realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't the floor that was moving. It was something under it, something beneath them. Crawling closer, the ground trembled once more. And this time, it wasn't just the floor. The walls were shifting too. The entire space around them seemed to be alive, bending and stretching like a living organism. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, more insistent. Charlie tried to move, but their feet were stuck. They couldn't run. They couldn't breathe. Their legs refused to obey, locked in place by an unseen force. And for a brief moment, they wondered if they had already entered a place beyond escape, a place that no one ever left. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, closer. It was as though something was carving its way through the earth itself, and Charlie realized, with a deep sense of dread, that it was coming for them. Something was burrowing its way up from the depths of this cursed place. Something hungry. Charlie's heart pounded in their chest as they took one slow step backward, then another, eyes wide in terror. They reached behind them, desperate for anything to grab onto, anything to steady themselves. But their hands met only cold, smooth stone, the same as everything else in this dark void. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a room. It wasn't even a place. It was a tomb, and they were its prey. The scraping stopped suddenly, and in the eerie silence that followed, a new sound emerged. A soft, low growl, something primal. Deep and guttural, it vibrated through the air, sending a shockwave of cold down Charlie's spine. The ground beneath them shifted again, and this time it wasn't just the floor that trembled, the walls. The entire place was moving, like it was a beast waking from its long, cursed sleep. The whispers began to change, their rhythm shifting, growing more chaotic, as if the very voices were driven by the hunger that had been patiently waiting, and now it had been roused. Charlie could feel it. The hunger wasn't just in the space around them, it was inside them. Every inch of their skin seemed to crawl with it, every fiber of their being screaming to escape. But escape was impossible. There was nowhere to go. The walls were too high, too smooth, the air too thick to breathe. "Help me," Charlie whispered, the words falling from their lips without meaning to, a reflexive plea, but no one was coming. They knew that. They knew the voices around them weren't real. They knew there was no one to save them, no one to hear them. "Please, no." The growl came again, louder this time, closer. The sound was so powerful, so alive, that it seemed to be vibrating through Charlie's bones. It was coming from below. No, beneath them. The floor beneath them was shaking violently now, and Charlie could feel something huge, something monstrous, moving beneath the surface of the earth. They could hear it, feel it, crawling up toward them, clawing at the ground, pushing through the stone with an unnatural strength. And then, the earth split. The crack in the floor was sudden, jagged, and immense. It tore through the ground like a wound in the earth itself, and from within it, something black and slick began to emerge. It wasn't a creature, not exactly. It was more like a shape, a thing that moved in the dark, writhing and shifting in a way that made Charlie's stomach churn. It had no form, no face. It was a living mass of shadows, a roiling, ever-changing thing that seemed to shift and contort as it climbed toward the surface. And then Charlie saw it, its eyes. Or rather, where its eyes should have been. Two dark, empty voids stared out at Charlie from within the writhing mass, and Charlie felt their heart stop. The hunger was alive, and it was staring at them. With a sudden, unnatural movement, the thing lunged. It didn't walk, it didn't crawl. It shot forward, covering the distance in an instant, and Charlie could only scream in terror as it enveloped them, swallowing them whole in an instant. There was no time to fight, no time to scream. The thing wrapped around Charlie, its slick, cold surface slipping into their skin, pressing into their body, until it was as if they were one with the darkness. And just like that, Charlie was gone. Chapter 8. The Crawling Silence. and the room seemed to breathe. Heavy, slow inhales that rattled the air with an unsettling sense of dread, as though the walls themselves were alive, pressing in from every side. Even the shadows seemed to be thickening, curling into themselves like the rotting tendrils of some forgotten thing. Something ancient, something hungry. The flickering light from the candles cast twisted, distorted shadows across the walls, each one stretching unnaturally long, as though reaching for Charlie. The flames danced with an eerie rhythm, their heat unbearable yet cold, their flickering pulse almost hypnotic. The air smelled of dust, rot, and something far worse, a decayed sweetness, like the stench of forgotten graves. Charlie was alone now. Or was it? Could they be certain of that anymore? The silence that had settled around them was profound, an unnatural quiet that filled the space with an oppressive weight. It was as though the whole world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind of quiet that offers solace. It was the kind of quiet that screamed in your ears, the kind that made your skin crawl and your mind turn in on itself. It was the silence of something watching, something waiting. From deep within the house came the faintest sound, something scraping, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper of wind brushing against the walls. But then it grew, a low, agonizing sound that set Charlie's teeth on edge. It wasn't wind. It wasn't any natural thing. It was the sound of something dragging itself through the darkness. Slowly, steadily. Charlie's heart began to race, but they were rooted in place, as though the very air around them had grown thick with dread, preventing any movement. It was all they could do to breathe, to focus on the rasping sound that grew closer with each passing second. Shh, came the voice again, this time more distinct, a sibilant whisper that wrapped around them like an iron vice. It was a command, a warning, but not one they could ignore. The air grew colder, and Charlie's breath became visible before them in the shape of frozen clouds. The silence stretched taut like a bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Every step they took felt like a betrayal of some unspoken pact they had unknowingly made with this place, this prison that kept tightening its grip around them. The walls creaked, groaned, as though the house itself were alive and stretching toward them, reaching out with unseen fingers. The crawling sound continued, now a chorus of scraping claws, slow and deliberate. It was moving closer. Charlie's eyes darted around the room, desperate to catch a glimpse of something, anything that could offer an escape. But the room was as it had always been, four walls closing in on them, the door locked, the windows sealed shut, and the same flickering light that offered no comfort. Their only company was the sound, the rasp of claws against stone, the breathless whispers that pressed against their eardrums. And then there was movement. A shadow flickered in the corner of the room. At first, it was so faint that Charlie wondered if their mind was playing tricks on them. But then it shifted again. Tangible, real, there. It moved too quickly to follow, a shadow that was never quite in the same place twice. Charlie took a step back, their pulse hammering in their throat. Was it the same figure they had seen before? The one that haunted the edges of their memory like a dark stain they could never wash away? No, this was different. This was something new, something far worse. The shadow reached out, touched them. A cold finger, icy and sharp, brushed against Charlie's skin, and the world around them seemed to freeze. Time itself paused, and for the briefest moment, Charlie was no longer in control of their body. Their muscles stiffened, as if the shadow had locked them in place, holding them hostage in the prison of their own skin. The whisper came again, louder now, more insistent. "Don't! Look!" But it was too late. With a jerky motion, Charlie turned, their eyes scanning the room, and that was when they saw it. An open door, one that hadn't been there moments before. It stood ajar, an invitation to something far darker, beckoning them with an unspoken promise of escape or damnation. The doorway stretched into an abyss, a void that seemed to go on forever, swallowing the very light that tried to escape its grasp. But the air around the door was wrong. It hummed with a low, vibrating energy, something that pulled at Charlie, tugging them toward it. The whispers in the air grew louder, more frantic, pleading. The scraping sounds, now deafening, filled the room, accompanied by a rumbling growl. Low, guttural, something not quite animal. The walls seemed to shudder with the weight of it. The figure, the shadow, was moving now, flowing across the room like liquid darkness. It didn't walk, it didn't crawl, it drifted, as if gravity had no power over it. And it was getting closer, closer, closer still. Charlie's heart was pounding in their chest now, each beat louder than the last, as if their body were about to burst from the strain. The figure reached out, its fingers stretching into the air, and the coldness it radiated swept across Charlie's face. It felt like a deep freeze, an ancient cold that pressed into their soul. The creature was upon them. The whispers turned into a scream, and Charlie felt their legs give way. Their knees buckled, and they fell to the floor, the world spinning in a dizzying whirl. But they couldn't move. The weight of the shadow was too much, too oppressive. Don't look." The voice that spoke now was different. It was no longer the voice of the shadow. It was something else. Something worse. Something hungry. And then, the room was filled with the sound of cracking. The walls split open, the floor buckling beneath Charlie as the house itself seemed to tear apart. But it wasn't the house that was cracking. No, it was something beneath it. Something far older than the structure itself. The growl grew louder. Closer. Its heat swept across Charlie's face, and the shadow seemed to stretch in every direction, reaching out to devour them whole. But just as the darkness was about to swallow them, someone, touched their hand. It was cold, so cold, but it wasn't the shadow. No, it was something else, something human. Chapter 8. The crawling silence continued. The chill in the air intensified, each breath a visible cloud that dissipated quickly, leaving only a trace of cold behind. Charlie's hand, still gripped by that unseen, icy force, trembled violently. The whisper was in their ear again, too close, its breath hot against their skin. "You don't want to look. You don't want to see what's behind that door." The voice was more guttural now, more desperate. Charlie tried to pull their hand away from the cold grasp, but the shadow tightened its hold. It felt as though the darkness had clung to them, seeping into their skin, sinking into their bones. There was no escape from it. No escape from this. The room seemed to warp, twisting like something half-formed in a nightmare. The walls groaned under some unseen pressure, expanding and contracting as if they were breathing. Inhale, exhale. The sound was rhythmic, like the pulse of a sleeping giant, and every beat of that dark, suffocating rhythm dragged Charlie further into the abyss. Then, as though some invisible force had pressed a button, the air around them thickened. The door, the one they had seen before, did not just stand ajar now. It was wider, almost as though it were calling out to them. The space behind it was an endless void, a gaping mouth that seemed to swallow all light. Without thinking, Charlie stumbled forward, their legs moving of their own accord, drawn toward the darkness. Every step they took felt like wading through thick, suffocating water, each motion slow and deliberate as if the very act of walking was an unnatural effort. The shadows stretched and curled in every direction, but it was the doorway to the unknown, that drew them in. "Don't go. Don't look. Don't open it." The warning was no longer a whisper. It was a scream, a voice so sharp, so full of terror, it threatened to tear the very fabric of the air itself. It wasn't their voice. It wasn't even the voice of the shadow. No, this voice came from deep within the ground, from below the house, from something that had been buried there for centuries. The growl, deep and animalistic, echoed again. This time, it was not just a growl. There was a shriek that followed, a shriek so horrible, so guttural, that it vibrated the bones in Charlie's body. The sound seemed to originate from the very walls, the floors, the ceiling. It was all around them. It was coming for them. Suddenly, the door snapped open with a violent crack. A cold gust of air blasted out of the opening, carrying with it the scent of mildew, decay, and something far worse. The smell was suffocating, cloying, like the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses piled together in the dark. It was the smell of something old, ancient and forgotten. Something that had been waiting, watching, and now, finally, it was waking. Charlie froze, unable to move. Every inch of their body screamed to turn and run, to flee this cursed house. but their legs refused to obey. They stood, paralyzed, staring into the open door, into the swirling darkness that beckoned them forward. And then they saw it. A pair of eyes gleamed from the dark, unnatural, glowing with an eerie light that seemed to reflect no source. It was the eyes of something that was no longer human. They were large, black, and unblinking, floating in the void as though they existed outside of time and space. They stared at Charlie, seeing them, judging them. The scraping sound returned, louder now, reverberating through the walls like the gnashing of bone against bone. And then, from the darkness, it emerged. It moved like smoke, like a shadow that had taken form. Its shape was amorphous at first, its features not fully visible, but Charlie could see the outline of a grotesque body, long limbs twisting unnaturally, crawling toward them with a terrifying fluidity. The thing did not walk. It slithered, inching its way across the floor as though it was a part of the very shadows themselves. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was translucent, glistening with some sort of slime that caught the faint light from the candles. The thing's mouth was nothing more than a cavernous opening, lined with jagged teeth that seemed to grow and twist as it moved closer. Its breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, as though it had not tasted air in 1,000 years. The door to the darkness swung wider, and Charlie found themselves drawn toward it. They didn't understand why. It was as though the creature was pulling them in with an invisible tether, and the more they resisted, the stronger it became. The scraping sound intensified, now accompanied by a sickening squelching noise, like wet flesh being dragged across stone. "Don't look!" the voice hissed again, but it was too late. The door behind the creature was no longer just a doorway. It had become a rift, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, and from the other side, something ancient, something vile, was beginning to emerge. The creature's eyes locked with Charlie's, and the world around them seemed to slow, everything fading into a hazy blur. Time itself seemed to stretch, as though the universe were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. But before it could reach them, the floor beneath Charlie cracked open with a deafening roar. The ground split apart like dry earth, and from the depths, a massive hand reached up, blackened, clawed, covered in decayed flesh. It grabbed Charlie by the leg, yanking them backward with an almost inhuman strength. Charlie screamed, their heart pounding in their chest, but no sound came out. The shadow was too deep, the void too vast. As the creature pulled them closer to the gaping maw of the earth, they looked back, their eyes wild, searching for something, anything to stop this madness. And that was when they saw the face. It was their own face. Not a reflection, no. This face was twisted, distorted, as though it were a broken mockery of their own features. The eyes were empty, hollowed out. The skin was stretched, almost like a mask. The thing that had once been human stared at Charlie, smiling, a slow, sadistic grin spreading across its face as it whispered, "We've been waiting for you." And then, everything went black. Chapter 9. The Rift and the Hollow Echoes. The air was thick with the metallic taste of dread. Charlie felt their body jerk, pulled against the suffocating darkness as the earth below split open, dragging them into an abyss that seemed to have no end. The force that gripped their leg was inhuman. A hand, no, something worse than a hand, clawed, sharp, and rancid with the scent of death. It felt as though the very ground wanted to consume them, to swallow them whole. And they could do nothing but scream as the void stretched wider, the walls of the house disappearing into the gaping maw. Time, it seemed, had lost all meaning. Seconds bled into minutes, and those minutes felt like hours. The shadows shifted, curling around them like a living thing, seeping into their very soul. And they could feel something terrible, begin to awaken deep within the hollow of their chest. The whispering voice was back, but it was no longer a mere murmur. It was a cacophony, 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, screaming, pleading, begging. It was the voice of every person who had ever stepped foot in this place, every soul who had dared to uncover its secrets. Come, closer. It's waiting. Charlie's body went numb as the earth continued to pull them into its depths. The dark hand clenched tighter, dragging them through the fissure in the floor toward an unknown terror. It wasn't just the weight of the darkness that pressed down on them. It was the knowledge, the absolute certainty, that they were not alone. In that fleeting moment of clarity, Charlie realized that something had already followed them into this hell. The creature, the one with the hollow eyes and the twisted grin, was not just an apparition or a figment of their imagination. It was real. It was here, and it was hungry. With a final terrifying yank, Charlie was thrown forward, slamming onto the cold, jagged stone. They gasped for air, their breath sharp and ragged as their eyes darted around the darkened space. The ground had changed beneath them, the smooth wood of the house replaced by rough, crumbling stone. It was like being thrown into the heart of some forgotten cavern, a place far beneath the earth where no light dared to venture. They looked up, their heart thudding in their chest, and there, looming above them, was the thing that had been chasing them. The creature stood tall, its long limbs wrapped in shadows, its form still amorphous, shifting, as though it was a part of the darkness itself. Its eyes, those eyes, gleamed like twin orbs of molten black, reflecting nothing but the void that surrounded them. The mouth was a cavernous gash in its face, dripping with thick, viscous saliva, each drop sizzling as it hit the ground. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, in the distance, Charlie could see others, more of them. More figures, more shadows, rising from the depths of the earth. They were like a horde of twisted, grotesque creatures, all with the same hollow eyes, the same monstrous mouths, the same endless hunger. They were all waiting, watching. Charlie scrambled to their feet, heart hammering, but they didn't know where to run. The space around them had shifted again, the walls of the cavern bending and warping, closing in like a trap. They had no choice but to look back at the thing, the creature that had led them here, its grin widening as it saw their terror. "It's time," the voice whispered again. This time it was not just a whisper, it was a command. Without warning, the ground beneath Charlie began to tremble, and with it, the cavern itself seemed to come alive. The walls cracked open, revealing twisting, writhing roots that reached up like fingers, grasping for them, dragging them back into the dark. The air was thick with a stench that burned their lungs, an acrid, foul odor that made their stomach churn. They tried to move, to run, but their legs were paralyzed with fear. The shadows wrapped around their ankles, tugging them down, dragging them toward the growing rift in the floor. The creature, no, the horror, stepped forward, its mouth opening wide, the cavernous gap growing impossibly large. "You don't have to run," it hissed. "You're already here." And then it lunged. Charlie couldn't scream. The air was gone, sucked out of the space around them, replaced by a suffocating force that crushed their chest, their lungs. Their heart raced in their throat, each beat a painful thud. The creature's sharp claws grazed their skin, sending a shock of pain through their body as it wrapped its cold fingers around their neck, lifting them off the ground. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, the absence of sound, of light, of reason. Then, the creature's voice returned, this time a whisper in their ear, smooth and low. "You're mine." With a final, horrific squeeze, the world went silent. Chapter 10. The Convergence. As the darkness, thick and suffocating, pressed in from every angle, Charlie's breath came in ragged gasps as they lay suspended in the inky blackness, their limbs numb, their heads spinning. There was no sense of up or down, left or right. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist around them, the space they inhabited both vast and claustrophobic. They tried to move, to scream, but the words died in their throat before they could take shape. The oppressive weight of the darkness crushed all sound, all sensation. The world had gone silent, and it was as though Charlie's very existence was being erased, slowly, piece by piece. In that vast nothingness, they could hear it again, the whisper. It was soft at first, like the brush of wind through dry leaves, but then it grew louder, clearer, more insistent. "You're here." The words echoed around them, reverberating through the darkness, and with them came a feeling, a sensation of movement. The shadows shifted, swirling in unnatural patterns, coiling around Charlie like tendrils. They could feel the coldness of them as they slithered across their skin, crawling into their lungs, into their mind. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, more pleading. "You're here. Come closer. We've been waiting." And then, with a sudden bone-jarring force, the world shattered. Reality tore open like the skin of an overripe fruit, revealing something far worse than anything Charlie had ever imagined. The dark void they had been trapped in collapsed inward, imploding, twisting, and warping as a vast rift tore through it. It was a chasm that stretched beyond the horizon, endless and unrelenting, pulling at everything, every object, every thought, every ounce of their soul. The rift was not a tear in space, it was a wound in the universe itself, and it was bleeding. Out of the tear poured an endless flood of darkness, a black so pure that even the smallest sliver of light was consumed by it. The air crackled with an energy so malevolent, so ancient, that it felt as though the very laws of nature were unraveling. The creature, the one that had haunted Charlie's every step, was there. It loomed at the edge of the rift, its twisted form taking shape from the swirling blackness, its body stretching and distorting as it pulled itself into existence. Its hollow eyes gleamed with an unholy light, reflecting the endless void. It was not merely a creature, it was a force, a manifestation of something older than time itself, and it was waiting. It reached out with long, spindly fingers, each one ending in claws that seemed to drip with something slick and wet. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, opening to reveal a cavern of darkness that seemed to devour everything in its path. Its breath came in slow, deep rasps, like the sigh of a dead thing finally awakening from a centuries-long slumber. You're not the one, but you will do," the voice rasped, not from the creature's mouth, but from all around Charlie. It was a chorus of voices, thousands, all speaking in unison, each one rasping, whispering, pleading and laughing in the same breath. Charlie was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. It was as though the very air around them had thickened, growing heavy, pressing them down, suffocating them in the weight of the thing's hunger. It was not the hunger of a mere animal. No, this was something far more terrible. This was a thirst that had existed since the beginning of time itself, a thirst that could never be quenched. And now it was looking at them. The creature's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Charlie thought they saw something like amusement flicker within the depths of the abyss. It stepped forward, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, and suddenly, Charlie could feel it. The pull. It was as though the universe itself was reaching out and grabbing them by the soul, dragging them toward the creature. "You will join us," the voice crooned. "Join us in the void. Come closer." Charlie's heart pounded in their chest, but no sound came from their mouth. The gravity of the situation pressed down on them, squeezing out all of their strength. Their body was not their own. It felt as though it had become part of the rift itself, part of the dark expanse that stretched into infinity. It was no longer a physical world they occupied, but something else, something beyond comprehension. And yet, amid the horror, there was something else, a whispering in the back of Charlie's mind, a flicker of hope. It was faint, like a dying ember in the center of a cold wind. Escape. The voice was faint, distant, but it was there. For the first time since being trapped in this hellish place, Charlie felt a surge of strength, a strange burning energy that began to crackle through their veins. The air around them thickened, crackling with power. It wasn't the void that controlled them anymore. It was something else, something deeper, something forgotten, a surge of will, a refusal to surrender. Charlie's eyes shot open, and for the first time, they were able to move. They jerked backward, the rift around them swirling violently, threatening to pull them back into the darkness. But they fought it. With every ounce of their strength, they fought. "No!" The word tore from their lips, raw and defiant. The creature howled, its massive form writhing in agony, its hollow eyes wide with rage. It reached out for them, its claws snapping like brittle bones, but Charlie was no longer in its grasp. They were slipping away, back through the rift, back toward the light. But the creature wasn't finished. It howled one final time, and the world around Charlie erupted into chaos. Everything around them twisted, stretched, and shattered as the rift seemed to implode in on itself. The creature's scream echoed, a sound that would haunt Charlie for the rest of their life. And then, there was nothing. The darkness swallowed everything whole.